Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. Today I'm joined by Reed Cooley to discuss For a New Liberty by Murray and Rothbard. We're going to focus on the end where Rothbard discusses a strategy for liberty. Mr. Cooley is a policy fellow with the Independent Institute and former vice president of communications at Young Americans for Liberty, formerly students of Ron Paul. Mr. Cooley, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Keith. Thanks for having me.
When it comes to this section, there are 5 mini sections within it. Let's start with part 1 is titled Education, Theory, and Movement. Rothbard asks, how can we achieve victory, social change, resting as it does on persuasion and conviction, can be an art rather than an exact science. He more or less explains education is the persuasion and conversion of large numbers of people to the cause. What do you think about this as a strategy, and what are some of the ideas you have towards achieving this end?
Well, the adjective timeless is a word that gets thrown around to describe a great many things that quite frankly don't deserve it. But let's put the entirety of the book For a New Liberty into perspective chronologically here for just a little bit. This was published in 1973, making it just under 50 years old. I would say that everything that Rothbard describes, not just in this final part 3 of the book, but also in part 1 and part 2 as well. I think that it does deserve, to be described as somewhat timeless. I can tell you that just a matter of several months ago, as I was reading For a New Liberty myself, I really felt like Rothbard was sort of speaking to me through time, if you know what I mean. Like he was speaking to issues that are so incredibly relevant today, right? So like you look at part 1 where he talks about the libertarian heritage. He gives a really good and concise breakdown of our philosophical tradition, going all the way back, through classical liberalism, right? All the way back to the levelers during the English Civil War. Part 2, libertarian applications to current problems. He's talking about issues in the year 1973, and obviously there are parts that are pretty, immediately recognizable as obsolete or something like that, right? Because the world has changed a good bit since 1973, but the vast majority of even that content is material that deserves a great deal of reflection today in the year 2022. But in part 3, A Strategy for Liberty, you get the feeling that Rothbard, he really is writing from his soul, right? And I guess that goes for the entirety of the book, but you're getting just pure, unfettered Rothbard throughout the entirety of the book. And then, so, he blows your mind in part 1 with, just giving a really beautiful synopsis of the libertarian heritage and the philosophical tradition across time. He then takes it and he applies it to the real world. And he says, look, here's the new libertarian approach on this issue, that issue, that issue. Then part 3, he ties it all back together with a nice, pretty Rothbardian bow. And he says, like, here's how you actually take that and you advance it. Here's how we, as he put it, achieve victory, with the sort of new libertarianism, here defined and enshrined throughout this book. So, I really felt like Rothbard was speaking to me, not just me, obviously. He was speaking in a way that resonated with me. As much as half a century later, I can tell you, just as I've worked with different institutions inside the liberty movement, I have really felt like what Rothbard is describing is exactly the kind of strategy that's really going to be needed. He's imparting a tiny little fraction of his wisdom on us to enjoy. But it seems to me that as profound as this strategy is, it's never been acted upon, right? And I think that as the liberty movement goes forward, here in the midst of COVID tyranny and every horrible thing happening in Canada right now, just as a sort of microcosm example, I think that it's a really exciting prospect to be able to take this strategy for liberty that Rothbard gave us, a long time ago, and apply that to the world that we're operating in today.
When you worked at Yale or currently as a policy fellow for the Independent Institute, what were some of the educational methods or one-liners or elevator pitches that you saw were really effective with grabbing people's attention and at least planting the seed? We're not expecting people to admit they've been wrong for 30 years in one conversation and then say, where do I donate? But as far as planting seeds go, with this educational approach that Rothbard talks about in a strategy for liberty, what has worked?
Well, a lot of people get the feeling that whenever you take something as beautiful as something as rich and as extensive and as complex as the Rothbardian tradition, right? And you break it down into a bullet point or a slogan or a tagline, that you're diluting it, that you're weakening it. But let's think about that proposition for a second. Did the phrase taxation is theft weaken the libertarian movement, or did it strengthen it? Did it carry it to completely and totally new audiences and make it memorable, to people who had never heard of Murray Rothbard, or maybe didn't understand the difference between the word libertarian and librarian until they saw taxation as theft on some meme on their Facebook page or their Twitter page or their Instagram page, and started to get kind of curious. I think that as we are doing what Rothbard prescribes here, and educating people, through our theory and through our movement, we have to understand that we're never going to shove the entire cheeseburger down people's mouths all at once. And that's something we can get to a little bit later with one of the subsequent subsections of part 3. But leaving the little breadcrumbs, that is not to say that you make your messaging less radical. You do not do that. You never, ever weaken the message, right? But you do take that one part of that radical message that's particularly poignant, that's particularly powerful, and you create a trail of breadcrumbs, so to speak, leading to that eventual cheeseburger at the very end of the trail, right? I will say that my capacity at Young Americans for Liberty was sort of a spearheading the entirety of the company's marketing efforts. Really, everything that you see in communications and marketing at Yale today is something that I created over a period of about 3 years. I brought in other great people who could help me act on some of those capabilities. And with marketing, you have to meet people where they're at. And that does not sound like a very radical rule of thumb, but you would be surprised at the amount of institutional pushback that you can face, even from other people who claim to be within our own camp, right? So, like, just to give you some real concrete examples of what I mean by that, so that I'm not speaking in such abstract terms. We started experimenting when I was at Young Americans for Liberty with retro wave marketing, right? We were following marketing trends that were happening completely and totally outside of the world of politics. I'm sure your audience knows a little bit about Edward Bernays, right? Pretty much, he's the father of public relations, and everything propaganda today is ultimately as a result of many of his theories, right? Propaganda obviously has a very sort of nefarious connotation, just because of its history, right? But I think that we all know exactly what I'm talking about there, and we don't necessarily have to explain why. But Edward Bernays strongly recommended that people who were, that people who were trying to market specific political ideals actually look to the world outside of politics, because politicians, political orgs, political movements, in comparison to major corporations or Fortune 500 companies or whatever they may be, they really pale in comparison whenever it comes to their ability to actually market an idea effectively and popularize it, propagate it, right? Hence the term propaganda. So we started studying market trends outside of the world of politics, specifically what sorts of artistic trends were becoming very trendy. In the media that people were digesting, the movies that people were watching, the kinds of social media content that they were engaging in that they thought was just because they thought that it was intriguing or appealing. And we understood, okay, well, for some reason in the world, it's getting kind of fashionable to utilize like 80s retro wave sort of synth wave marketing, right? It was just something that we noticed. So we started using a lot of that to our advantage and creating a bit of brand differentiation for Young Americans for Liberty. With the graphics that we were creating every day, memes, videos, even like the marketing for the organization's events, all of that great kind of stuff. So I think that in terms of marketing the ideas effectively, we have to look at what is working outside of the world of politics, because the overwhelming majority of marketing that is done in this world is not in the world of politics. And that means that the overwhelming majority of innovation in the world of marketing and public relations, that's happening very, very independent of the world of politics. And the world of politics is really just catching up on the sorts of theories that people in the private sector are innovating every single day, right? So yeah, I would say, going back and reading public relations or propaganda or other works by Edward Bernays, that was a really, really good starting point, for us. And it actually encouraged us to reach out a little bit more and try to understand the world outside of politics. But in addition to that, I spent a lot of time studying George Orwell, because George Orwell, as prolific as he was, I mean, it's no surprise that he wrote things like Politics in the English Language, his essay that was published right after World War II, in which he describes so many of the mistakes that are made in political communication, and exactly how communication in politics works whenever it is done successfully and why it does so successfully. Common tropes that you want to avoid whenever you're communicating politically. I think that it is accurate to say that marketing the ideas of liberty is kind of a new frontier. I believe that, but marketing political ideas is not, right? I mean, propaganda is not a new profession, right? It's not a new discipline, and we owe it to ourselves to understand what our enemies have been doing right, how we can learn from that so that we can properly wage war against the state and our enemies in the state who terrorize us every day. So, yeah.
I love the idea of looking at successful marketing operations outside of the political realm. So if I'm trying to think of a specific Super Bowl commercial that I liked, the Larry David one was hilarious. The Sopranos one I loved, but just the general idea of a group of friends sitting around, smiling, laughing, hugging each other, and then drinking Michelob Ultra. So it's not like they show you the can, they list the costs and benefits of drinking it, they list how much it is. They're not going off the facts and the specifics. They're just associating your brain, something happy, something that you want, a desire, friendship, belonging, acceptance, happiness, and they're associating that with Michelob Ultra. So maybe we just need someone to walk around to LP conventions because and catch people smiling and holding copies of Anatomy of the State or something as a marketing ploy. Because I got to tell you, I had so much fun. I sort of went there reluctantly to the one in Arizona because I didn't know much about the LP. I had never been to a single meeting before, and we had an absolute blast. So yeah, that is definitely one area we can copy. I love the concept of meeting people where they're at. Hans Hoppe wrote a article, The Libertarian Quest for Grand Historical Narrative, and he talks about the 10 Commandments. There's like, what, 1 billion or 2 Christians on the planet, Catholics, Christians, and he takes the 10 Commandments and says, anyone who takes this seriously has to come down with the libertarian concept of thou shall not steal, thou shall not murder. These are private property, natural law concepts that really only the libertarian accepts, because any philosophy that has a state, especially an interventionist one, clearly violates thou shall not murder in practice. And in theory, all of them violate the thou shall not steal or bear false witness. So I love meeting people where they're at, or telling a progressive, I just support the equality among people to engage in all capitalist acts between consenting adults. At that point, they go, I just spent 10 years arguing that gay marriage is legitimate because it's a voluntary agreement between two consenting adults. It's rough that it's not like that converts them, but it gives them a little bit of insecurity about arguing against it, because they're arguing, okay, so I'm against the voluntary cooperation. All right, well, I'm a little less confident than I was leaving the Bernie rally, but I'm not quite there. Excellent contributions on the marketing. Before we get into the second section of this, is there a meme that you are especially proud of during your time as the VP for communications at Yale? A meme or a post or a comment?
Probably all of them, to be honest. But I would just have to say that everything that was produced throughout my team, throughout my time there, was a team effort. I wouldn't feel completely comfortable just co-opting anything that was done and saying that's what I feel most proud of, right? Because it takes more than one person, to really make the kinds of things that we're talking about happen. There's one thing you just said that I think we would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge here. A lesson that I would commonly impart to the people who were working for me was that we don't communicate information, right? That's a common misconception when it comes to propaganda, right? Which I obviously don't mean in any nefarious term. Whenever you think of yourself as a libertarian propagandist, it can help provide, at least in my experience, a little bit of clarity about exactly what it is you're doing, right? So like whenever you're creating like libertarian propaganda, let's call it that for fun purposes, you're not communicating information, you're communicating emotion. That was a very common sort of lesson that I would give. And I would ask, what emotion do you want to convey? What emotion do you want to evoke in the viewer with this particular meme or this video or this press release that you're going to put out there? Is it happiness, like in the case of the Michelob commercial that you were describing a minute ago? It could be. Could it be hope, perhaps optimism? Or is it anger, frustration, maybe resentment? Maybe you're trying to tap into resentment at something horrible that the government has done, whatever that may be, right? So maybe understanding the emotion that you want to convey in the story that you're trying to tell, right? Maybe that's a very good starting point for creating a piece of content that you hope will educate people and bring them in mass numbers to the cause.
There is a section, and I know I'm moving ahead here, where Rothbard says, thus the historians Lawrence Stone stresses as a requirement for radical change, a decay in the will of the ruling elite. The elite may lose its manipulative skill, or its military superiority, or its self-confidence, or its cohesion. It may become estranged from the non-elite, or overwhelmed by a financial crisis. It may be incompetent or weak or brutal. So let's take one of the ones the CEO was unhappy with. The meme was more or less, find someone who laughs at your jokes the way Kamala Harris laughs at a question she doesn't know the answer to. When you have something like that, you are totally delegitimizing the elite in such a way that's not like, well, people have to understand Austrian business cycle theory. It's like, don't you think it's funny? The second in charge, when we think of the hierarchy, of course, she's not calling any shots, but president, vice president, that's how you think. That's how the average person, someone that high up is a moron. And when she's asked about inflation, gives the most, I just wish that she'd say, I haven't looked into that. I'm going to talk to my experts and have a well thought out answer for you. In 48 hours, follow me on Twitter. If she said that, I would be blown away at the amount of humility.
Right.
But of course not. They have no
No.
humility and no intellect. So when you're doing memes like that, it's not just funny, blowing off steam. You're actually delegitimizing these people in a way that can communicate with the common man. So when the moron does not appreciate that, it just shocks me to no end. So I thought so much of the work you guys did. To be honest, I didn't know. I wasn't aware of you specifically until I heard you on my friend Pete Quinones' show. But I had always followed the Gal account and loved it. So yeah, great stuff there. Any ideas on the decaying will of the ruling elite?
On the decaying will of the ruling elite. Well, that was a long excerpt that you gave there, but I think that I could make a few broad observations both about that and a little bit that you've shared about Kamala Harris here, and that is that we should never underestimate the power of ridicule, right?
Yes.
Because ridicule, I believe it was Saul Alinsky who wrote about this in Rules for Radicals. Never ever underestimate the power that ridicule can have on your opponent, right? So that you can exploit the sorts of vulnerabilities that I believe the passage you pointed out was making clear there, right? So, I'm a firm believer in the power of ridicule. I don't think that mocking people who are committing mass murder is off limits. I'm just being honest. I think that if they're drone striking people, which in my opinion is probably the most unethical thing you can do to that you can do to another human being, or if they're extending forgiveness to people who have drone-stricken people, then why is mocking them and ridiculing them and belittling them off limits? It absolutely shouldn't be, right? And so we didn't talk about this whenever we were talking about emotions that we would want to convey through our content, whether they're happiness or optimism or anger or sadness. But comedy can be an incredibly powerful tool for freedom of speech. Look at there's one human being who right now might actually be doing more for liberty than anybody else in this country, and he happens to be a stand-up comedian. And I think we both know I'm talking about Joe Rogan, right? A person who's obviously used comedy in just this massive platform. But comedy can be such an incredibly powerful tool. It should never, ever be underestimated. Exactly what can be done by mocking, ridiculing, belittling, whatever it may be. And I think that whenever we're looking at the sort of arsenal of propaganda that we can have at our disposal, right? The different kinds of weapons that we can keep on our hip, so to speak, in our war against the state. I think comedy is one that we might want to rely on a bit more than we initially think.
There was a libertarian comedian that was just here in Chandler, and he goes, Joe Biden's a really good guy. I mean, he's more or less provoking a war with Russia, nuclear power, and we might have to risk, sending guys over there, them dying, getting PTSD, getting their limbs blown off. But that's the sacrifice Joe is willing to make. And I didn't say it as well as he did, but the punchline is he's so nice, he's willing to risk everyone else's safety, knowing that Hunter Biden is going to be fine, Jill Biden's going to be fine. And it was just so funny because it wasn't even a libertarian topic. This was just a random, like, everyone gets 5 minutes on the stage kind of thing. I went up to him and shook his hand, and we had a good talk after. But the point is like, isn't that hilarious that he could just bring that up, and the room, it killed, absolutely killed. Granted, it was like 1 a.m. and a lot of people were drunk at the time. The point is that with just like a 30-second introduction into the mind of what it's probably like to be a politician, of, they're spending other people's resources and don't face accountability. Do you know that you advocating for more war or more welfare has nothing to do with compassion? It lacks compassion because you're advocating theft and murder. That is just so powerful. Took me decades of reading to learn what this guy, told in a 30-second joke. So I love the comedy aspect of things. One final thing in the first part of A Strategy for Liberty, he says, a flourishing movement with a sense of community and esprit de corps is the best antidote for giving up liberty as hopeless or an impractical cause. What do you think are some of the best ways that people in the liberty movement can find a sense of community?
Well, I think that this goes back to this two-part definition that Rothbard gave of education, right? So he talks about education. He defines it in sort of as having two components. One is theory, and the other is movement, right? I want to break this down a little bit because this is going to get to another point that I think is going to really address, the heart of your question. But I got to give a little bit of backstory for your audience first. So he says that that you have to have theory and movement in order to have a proper effort to educate the public, right? So the theory, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. You have to have a movement with a deep and reliable understanding of what this new libertarianism is about, of what the Rothbardian philosophy is about, right? But without theory, without that strong understanding of the philosophy and what makes us different, you might have a lot of outreach. You might have some really successful engagement efforts. You might have some really great memes. You might even have some really successful fundraising efforts that allow you to host large events or spearhead these strong student activism campaigns, or you might even capture a lot of media along the way for yourself or for an organization or whatever else. But do you even know what you're promoting? If you have no theory, but you have a lot of movement, or you have a tenuous grasp on the theory, but a lot of movement. In this case, I think it can be illustrated as it's like having a movement that's 1,000 miles wide, but only an inch deep, right? We contrast this with this scenario in which we have a movement with a lot of theory, but no movement, right? So you can have a group of people with the deepest understanding as to the philosophy of libertarianism, right? You can have people who are all, let's say you have 100 people in your group, or let's say 50 people in your group, and they're all PhDs and various things from Austrian economics to sociology to history to whatever it may be, right? Yeah, you can have that, but if you don't have movement, if you don't have those people or people around them who are true grassroots operatives, engaging the media, engaging communities, engaging college campuses, because Rothbard does make mention of student activism in this chapter as well, then you're just going to have an echo chamber. In this case, to contrast this from the previous scenario, you have a movement that is 1,000 miles deep, yet only 1 inch wide, right? Neither one of these are really ideal. So in order to have a movement that is sufficiently deep and sufficiently wide, you have to have both theory and movement simultaneously, or as Rothbard himself puts it, theory and movement become both sterile and futile without each other. But I think this addresses the heart of your question, and I had to give a little bit of background before I could jump into it. Rothbard also emphasizes the importance of continual self-education, right? You have to keep the ranks healthy as far as their understanding of the philosophy, so that they can be always ready to advance the movement in whatever way may be necessary. So you have to literally foster a culture. You have to cultivate an understanding of the philosophy of liberty within our very own ranks, because if they don't have that, they're in absolutely no position to educate anyone else on it. Obviously, you have to understand something before you can educate someone on it. Go figure. So you have to cultivate that. You have to build a culture of people who want to know more about liberty, who challenge one another's ideas on the philosophy of liberty, and aren't afraid to engage in a little bit of a Socratic wisdom. That is to say, some humility, and acknowledge maybe parts of the philosophy they don't yet understand. And you have to have a culture of people who trust each other enough to do that. So you have to invest in each other's grasp on the philosophy of liberty in a way that is done in good faith and with a very sober understanding as to the seriousness of the movement.
Next section in the A Strategy for Liberty portion, he says, are we utopians? He says, we therefore should not frighten people off by being too radical. or rather, he's saying that this is a common objection of the gradualists, saying we should not frighten people by coming off as too radical. He says, in the field of strategic thinking, it behooves libertarians to heed the lessons of Marxists because they have been thinking about strategy for radical social change longer than any other group. Now, this is so vitally important. I mean, Marx writes the manifesto in 1848, and today 29% of college students are identifying with Marxist ideologies. 17% of professors in the social scientists identify explicitly as Marxists. It's been tried in multiple continents on the planet, so he's totally right here. Thus, the Marxist sees two critically important strategic fallacies that deviate from the proper path. One they call left-wing sectarianism, the other, and opposing deviation, right-wing opportunism. He says that the major problem with the opportunists is that by confining themselves strictly to gradual and practical programs that stand a good chance of immediate adoption, they are in grave danger of completely losing sight of the ultimate objective. He goes on to quote Hayek. One of the great attractions of socialism has always been the continuing stress on its ideal goal and idea that permeates, informs, and guides the actions of all those striving to attain it. I guess you pretty much answered all of that in your previous answer. Okay, here's one final thing. He says, Hayek's reason for stressing the ultimate goal, the excitement and enthusiasm that a logically consistent system can inspire. Look at the left today. Medicare for all, unapologetic things. My body, my choice. We're here, we're queer, get used to it. Education's a right. Racism is inherently bad. These are all blanket, unapologetic statements that have given them so much power and influence. Any concept or any comment on the are we utopian section?
Oh, you just did a fantastic job of summarizing it, if I may say so myself. Have you ever thought about giving a class on this, Keith?
Yes, that would be nice. Maybe Tom Wood's School for Life will hire me. This is my application.
Well, I still think there's a lot of commentary to be had on this, nonetheless. So I think that he's right to point to the Marxists. First off, I think that that's something that most reasonable people listening to this podcast would agree with. If they don't, then I'm happy to hear them out. But does anyone question the success of the Marxists over the last century and a half of propagating their ideology to the absolute fullest extent? If they don't, then I would love to hear their argument as to how. But he talks about the people who want to dilute the ideas by engaging in the sort of right-wing opportunism, I believe, is how he refers to it here, right? And he has a quote that stands out to me in particular, and that is, he who advocates for a 2% tax reduction helps to bury the goal of abolishing taxes altogether, right? That this sort of Fabian approach, as Rothbard describes it throughout this section of the book, it's not just destructive, to the end goals, right? To the ultimate objective of liberty, which is to abolish the state completely, right? It's also, it leads to mass numbers of defection, right? Because who wants to stick around in a movement dedicated to cutting taxes 2%? Like, how many people are going to be genuinely excited about these 1 millimeter or 2 millimeter wins, right? Who is excited about mediocre, right? Who is excited about the idea of being a part of the center, right? It's just as the very brilliant Jeff Deist always says, nothing interesting happens in the center. Everything interesting always happens at the peripheries. It always happens at the margins, right? So Rothbard talks about this, 49 years ago. He talks about, whenever the movement is moderate or milquetoast, or it engages in various trade-offs for opportunistic reasons, or maybe because it wants to be a more pragmatic sort of movement, right? You cannot possibly maintain the ranks that way. You can't possibly you might recruit a lot of people, sure, but you're never going to ever retain those people, right? So I think that Rothbard is talking about something that we can point to with a couple of organizations in particular. There's the Cato Institute, for example. They're widely pointed to as an organization that underwent a very serious shift over the last decade. And a lot of people like to point out that they've also lost their influence, that their Twitter page has nothing even close to what it should be, getting, for example, right? It's just whenever you allow yourself or your organization to be absorbed into this greater beltway libertarianism, or you allow it to be compromised, as we see is the case with a lot of libertarian organizations, I'm afraid, you lose what makes liberty an exciting prospect in the first place, right? And to the average worker in the amidst the Industrial Revolution, whether they were an impoverished worker, working in the factories of Great Britain, or whether they were here in the United States, right? The prospect of a class war, right? The prospect of overthrowing the bourgeoisie was a very exciting one to the people at the time. It was a very exciting narrative, something that people would want to be a part of. So we have to find a way to properly craft the story of everyday people having long been victimized by the state and its many apparati, finally getting sick of it and casting off the yoke of state tyranny, right? We have to find a way to tell that story in a very compelling sort of way. And I don't think that's quite as difficult as we might make it out to be, right? But I think that we're going to have to find a way to properly tell that story in a way that makes the very people we're trying to reach want to be a part of the movement that we're advancing, right? And you can't, who wants to be a part of a boring story, right? Have you ever had to sit through think of the most boring book that you had to read in school, okay? Whether you were in private school or whether you were in one of these government indoctrination camps that we comfortably call public school, that we euphemize as our public schools, right? Think about the most boring piece of literature that your teacher made you read, and then try and think about, okay, what if the libertarian philosophy was just as boring to people as that book, right? Would it be a philosophy that you would want to be responsible, at least in part, for helping promote? Probably not, right? Nobody wants to be a part of a boring story. So we have to make sure that the story that we're telling, right, which is not a fictional story, it's a very real story with very real implications for very real people, is one that is exciting and compelling and invites people to be a part of it.
I love that you use the word story. That makes me think of how narratives or prevailing interpretations of past events are really what grab people's attention. Because you should hear the way people tell me the story of, well, there was deregulation by Glass-Steagall, and then what happened was the financial crisis, not realizing that the major companies that failed had nothing to do with the Glass-Steagall repeal, like AIG and Lehman Brothers. In other words, this is so obviously not even close to being true, but people feel so comfortable aligning themselves with that story. Well, we had child labor, then child labor laws, now we don't have child labor. Well, they work for free in government schools, which is worse than getting on the job experience. But even that, kids had worked since the beginning of time, yet because of that story, because of that narrative, they pin child labor on the voluntary sector. Since even though kids have been working on farms since, let's call it the days of Adam and Eve, since whenever. So look at how stories are really where people get their information from. It's not statistics or anything. So thank you for using the word story. I love Rothbard's shot at the Buckleys of the world on page 381. It is the conservative laissez-fairist, the man who puts all the guns and all the decision-making power into the hands of the central government and then says, limit yourself. It is he who is truly the impractical utopian. It seemed out of place, so I go, that has to be a shot at the National Review guys or something. But so very often we talk about well, should we support Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, these people? They're so good. I mean, when it comes to like something like, should we have a no-fly zone over Syria? And Rand Paul is the only one talking sense. Yes, we should support Rand Paul and Tulsi Gabbard. So how do we know when we should support people who don't totally agree with us? He says, how then can we know whether any halfway measure or transitional demand should be hailed as a step forward or condemned as an opportunistic betrayal? There are two vitally important criteria for answering this crucial question. One, that whatever the transitional demands, the ultimate end of liberty be always held aloft as the desired goal. And two, no steps or means ever explicitly or implicitly contradict the ultimate goal. Any ideas on how we can know whether or not we're selling out when we try to make friends with conservatives, progressives, minarchists, etc.?
I think that this is probably where part two becomes a little bit more useful, right? As we're trying to, so to speak, separate the wheat from the chaff, right? So understanding whether or not the end goal of a policy is ultimately is to achieve liberty, right? Well, I think that we can understand that there are certain policies that are that cannot be justified in any sort of libertarian sense, meaning that there is no way a person can go through enough mental gymnastics to convince themselves or any other person that said policy is something that can possibly produce liberty in our lifetime. Some examples: if a person supports drone strikes or engaging in war with a foreign power over some alliance or over some speck of land, however significant or insignificant, it's impossible to say that such an idea can advance liberty in any way. You cannot have liberty without life, right? And war is the health of the state. So if a person supports war, for example, right, for any reason other than self-defense, okay, then it just seems there is no way you can justify that in any sort of libertarian sort of sense. And that's one example. The Federal Reserve is another, right? So, and I'll be frank, the reason why I completely disavow the Chicago School and the monetarists is because their goal is not to end the Federal Reserve, right? They want to keep the Federal Reserve around, but in a more limited and crippled form. They want to keep a lower, they want to keep lower interest rates, but their goal is ultimately not to end this central bank that we have here in the United States, founded in the very dark year of 1913, that has doomed us to lifetimes of financial slavery, right? That has absolutely corrupted the social fabric and the culture of the United States. This is why I say that the Austrian school is the only valid and logically consistent method of actually applying the principles of liberty to economics, right? So if the goal is not to completely eliminate war, to bring the world to a condition where war is a virtual impossibility, or to completely eliminate central banking completely, then we can say there is no place for them inside of our movement. There just isn't, right? So there are certain issue areas that maybe we have to identify issue by issue, right? Where we can say, okay, well, the end goal of this cannot possibly produce liberty, and that is clearly not the objective of the people espousing this particular policy. It's best that we keep them out of our ranks.
And the good thing is we have, as far as your point on the Federal Reserve, Ted Cruz came out yesterday and he was talking about how important Bitcoin is as an option for people to use. And he says Elizabeth Warren hates it because they can't control it. When it comes to your foreign policy point, Trump brags about how he was the first president in however long to not start any new wars. So we do have a lot of people that it's not just that, well, this is us and people can either love us or leave us. That people are constantly coming over. Have you heard Walter Block say that he asked Rothbard in 1963 how many libertarians they were, and Rothbard goes, probably 15. And then that was in 1963. So it's as discouraging as things are. I mean, people are seeing through the nonsense
Right.
of statism. Rothbard goes on, next section, is education enough? Our hope is to convert the mass of people who are being victimized by state power, not those who are gaining by it. Any comment on that?
Well, yes. I guess it's difficult to think about, where to begin with it, because there are so many different directions in which we can take it, right? We have to make sure that people understand, and this is actually going to bring us back to the very beginning of our conversation, where we were talking about meeting people where they're at, right? Where we were talking about reaching people through comedy or through happiness or through angst and resentment, whatever different method that we have to make it clear to people exactly what it is, exactly how it is that their lives are affected every single day. There's a term I like to throw around, which is bread and butter issues, right? I don't see anything wrong with advancing the ideas of liberty and doing so through bread and butter issues that people care about. And during the era of COVID tyranny, when people are seeing that the state now has the power to lock them in their homes or force them to get a vaccine or take their jobs away or whatever other horrible thing it may be, right? I think that we absolutely should be talking about exactly how this affects everyday people, right? And this brings us to the foreign policy point. I have observed, and this is purely anecdotal, by the way, but I have observed that it is difficult to really convince people that, that what happened in December, or what looked like it was going to happen in December and January with the whole Russia and Ukraine business, that it has direct implications for them, that this is a very, very bad thing for our republic that they should really care about, and here's how. The challenge is on us to take the sort of esoteric issues that happen amongst the political elite and communicate them to the people we're trying to educate, to the people that we're trying to convert, in ways that explain to them that, here are the implications for you. Here is how it affects you. That, those taxes that come out of your paycheck, right? We have to connect the dots between that and war, or that and inflation, right? I mean, it does seem like inflation is at the top. It's at the highest point in the news cycle that I've ever seen it in my lifetime, in my 28 years on this earth. I mean, and so it is becoming more and more clear in a very sort of organic way what kind of implications the state's actions have on everyday people. But we do have to use good bread and butter issues to communicate to people the kinds of emotions that we wish to communicate, right? So I don't see any problem, even in a strategic perspective, with forging temporary, like one-issue coalitions, right? Based on single issues. I don't necessarily see a problem with that, right? If there's something that the conservatives or progressives are really upset about, and it happens to align with us, right? Let's employ the Horton rule. Let's criticize the right from the right. Let's criticize the left from the left. Let's build those single issue coalitions. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not a mortal sin, right? That's this thing that we like to call politics, right? That's just how it works. So focusing on bread and butter issues, actually communicating to people how their daily lives are impacted by the state. There's nothing wrong with any of this, and we have to understand that under the control of the American superstate, right? If you exist inside of these 50 states, there is no escape from the impact of the state. You can be the most reclusive and withdrawn person within the boundaries of this country, and you still will not escape, the influence and the grasp of the superstate, right? That we live under. So I think that we have to make people understand, no, there's no force other than perhaps gravity that impacts your life more than government, right? And it's going to have serious implications on you whether you like it or not.
We'll look at all of the cries about how if there's anything that needs to be done to get food stamps, like filling out papers, Katie, oh gosh, I forget her name, Congresswoman was holding up 6 pages and says, look at all these things people have to fill out for food stamps. This is ridiculous. People don't have time for this. People are starving. And I go, look, I tried running a business 7 or 8 years ago. I would have killed for 6 pages of regulation and things that I need to fill out. Do you know how many people are stopped from achieving their ends, whether it's food stamps or which need to be pushed to the voluntary sector, but how much innovation is stopped because of a lot more than 6 pages of regulation? Half the states in America have certificate of need laws where hospitals can't be built unless they get the permission from competing hospitals to get built. You think that restricts supply at all? You think the restriction of supply has any effect on the price, whether there's one hospital or 50,000? You think that has a difference on what the price is? Occupational licensing, of course. And these monopoly standards. We're always told that the free market might produce monopolies, and they explicitly advocate monopolies when it comes to standards. Just give me competing standards with voluntary agencies. So the reason I'm so pissed, I had to renew my health plan the other day, and I've been pissed off about it nonstop because I know that the price of cars, cell phones, microphones, computers, clothes, all these things come down because of aspects of the voluntary sector, competition, and freedom to disassociate. And when I see the cost of healthcare, I mean, it's killing people. It's just terrible. So we need to take the healthcare banner away from the Bernies of the world because he's the one making it more expensive. So Rothbard lists a few groups. He says, which groups should we be looking at? Campus youth, he says, one of them. They'll be interested in abolition of the draft, ending the Cold War, civil liberties, drugs, and victimless crimes. He says middle America. He mentions taxation, inflation, crime, welfare scandals, police monopolizing, stopping crime is a terrible way to approach crime that exists. Small businessmen, their individual talents and energies can at last have full room to expand and to provide improved technology and increased productivity for them and all of us, their potential customers. He then says what we might be looking for is a crisis situation, a breakdown of the existing system, which calls for a general search for alternative solutions. Any comments on the section, which groups?
Well, it's just fascinating that as we've gone through this part of For a New Liberty, we've actually talked about each one of those books before, each one of those groups, before even arriving at this particular section, right? It was student groups, middle America, and small business owners, right? I don't think that it's a coincidence that Murray Rothbard was writing about the necessity of really appealing to those groups 49 years ago. And it really seems like whenever I study what the Liberty Coalition is, so to speak, right? Because I'll give just a little bit of an historical parallel. Like there was this sort of New Deal coalition that was built, at the height of at the Roosevelt regime, right? The FDR regime, the second Roosevelt regime, right? This sort of New Deal coalition, as it was criticized, as it was described commonly. Whenever I try to imagine the same thing, but for liberty, right? It does seem like it's an admixture of college students, just like, the kind of college student that I was when I was first getting involved with Young Americans for Liberty back at Baylor University in 2014 and 2015. It's good, hardworking, middle Americans, blue collar people in the heartland who are really shouldering so much of the brunt of this Leviathan super state that we're living under. And it's also small business owners who are either having their dreams completely crushed by burdensome regulations, which are nothing new, or they're having their businesses completely taken away from them. They're having the American dream snatched right out of their hand, right off of their dinner plate. because of COVID tyranny, right? Because of mandates and lockdowns and all these other horrible sorts of things, right? So whenever I imagine what I think, this sort of liberty coalition could look like, that could really make the 21st century a century about liberty, it's not something that looks too awfully dissimilar from what Murray Rothbard was describing 49 years ago.
Hans Hoppe once said that without local enforcement of federal edicts, the laws are more or less hot air. So, in other words, focusing on local politics is pretty good. I mean, the same reason we never got arrested for underage drinking or drug use is because none of our friends recognized the legitimacy of cops to arrest us. So none of us reported it to the cops. So when it comes to something like this, what have you seen work as far as local politics and local issues being a step in the right directions? Is it things like door-to-door activities? Is it city council? Is it just going to these places and speaking? What have you found to be a positive move in the right direction?
Well, there are several examples. I think one that I could point to would be my friend Eric Brakey in the state of Maine. He was a former state senator up there, longtime activist inside of the Ron Paul Revolution. And because of his work within the Maine State Senate, they were actually able to nullify the federal government in several different ways, one of which included a right to try legislation, right?
Yes.
I think that that was absolutely huge. Being able to use a state government in this case, but it's a state government. Technically, it's nullification on the state level, but every single member of that state legislature, both in the state Senate and the state House, they're elected by their neighbors. They're elected by their immediate communities, right? And those are the people who comprise that state government. So I think that that's one great example, being able to nullify the FDA on the state level. That's not a small achievement. And that's something that we should be paying a lot more attention to, once again, especially in the height of COVID tyranny. We also see the example of Knox County Mayor Glenn Jacobs in Knox County, Tennessee, right? Standing up to the federal government and vowing that he's not going to issue any new COVID restrictions on the people of Knox County. I do think that, I'm a little bit of I don't think this is a word, but I'm going to use it anyway. I'm a nullificationist. And I think that that's going to begin on the local level and the state level. I'm also an advocate of radical decentralization. I believe that that's a very sort of natural process that's going to occur regardless, but I don't see anything wrong with libertarians being active and helping expedite that process. By engaging in the very kinds of theory and movement that Rothbard discussed, but doing so on a local level, within their city halls, within their county governments, approaching sheriffs and mayors. And I don't see that there's anything that tells us that we shouldn't be focusing on using the powers of local and state power, using the powers of local and state governments to nullify the edicts of the federal or the central government. I think that that's an incredibly valid way of advancing liberty in our lifetime. So I'm a nullificationist and I'm a radical decentralizationist, both of them. So.
Excellent points. Anyone who disagrees with that, they might not even understand what the state is. They're attempting to centralize and monopolize violence among hundreds of millions of people. So the step in the opposite direction would be to decentralize and have competing realms of authority, whether it's parents, church, the country clubs, book clubs, organizations. So excellent points there. I got two more questions for you, Mr. Cooley. Thank you so much for your time. Finally, we have Toward a Free America, the final section. Only we provide the really sharp and genuine break with the encroaching statism of the 20th century. Only we offer technology without technocracy, growth without pollution, liberty without chaos, law without tyranny, the defense of property rights in one's person and in one's material possessions. The enormous success of Karl Marx and Marxism has been due not to the validity of his ideas, all of which indeed are fallacious, but to the fact that he dared to weave socialist theory into a mighty system. Liberty cannot succeed without an equivalent and contrasting systematic theory, and until the last few years, despite our great heritage of economic and political thought and practice, we have not had a fully integrated and consistent theory of liberty. Final thoughts on Toward a Free America.
Well, it's worth pointing out the first two words of that excerpt. Correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't they only we? He
Yes.
uses absolute language there, and that is worth emphasizing for a couple of reasons. And we could go back to chapter 1 to reflect on that just a little bit. He talks about how, there's the right-wing opportunism, right? There's the stupidity and the inconsistency of the political right in granting to the state all of its weapons, right? But saying, okay, maybe we can keep this restrained. Maybe if we empower the state with a monopoly on violence and we give it, the largest military ever assembled, it won't come back on us one day, right? So that's just utter stupidity. But of course, he doesn't reserve this sort of incendiary criticism for just the right. He gives a very good synopsis of the left, right, and how the left really outgrew, as we understand it today, or liberalism, as it was known before around the New Deal period, before the top of the 20th century, became co-opted with this love for imperialism and militarism and these other hideous forms of statism, right? It seems as Rothbard describes it as though the left has they claim to have a very strong emphasis on human rights, but they completely forget about all the other kinds of rights, such as the most important, like property rights. The left has so much respect, or they claim to have so much respect for human rights, but they neglect and shun property rights altogether. So with both the conventional right and the conventional left, you have a neglect of at least one very serious component of liberty, right? And so, yes, I don't think that it's inaccurate to say that it really is only libertarianism that can provide the kinds of conditions that he went on to elaborate on further in the quote you just provided. Things like law without tyranny, for example. So I think that he really does a great job of taking that particular excerpt and tying that back to a lot of observations that he makes at different points throughout part 1, such as the one where that I just elaborated on, where he talks about why libertarianism is rooted originally in not opposition to the left, but in opposition to the right, and explaining exactly how the left became bastardized and sort of morphed, sort of devolved into what we see and what we deal with today.
My final question is, what is the most important thing you learned during your time working at Young Americans for Liberty?
Wow. So I was at Young Americans for Liberty for a long time. I got active with them in 2018. Seriously, after really being involved with them on college campuses before that. The single most important thing that I learned there, thinking in terms of the superlative, I think that we need to understand exactly why organizations lose sight of the mission. I think that we need to understand exactly what it takes to build an organization that will be foolproof from these sorts of things. And I think that that's where it does get back to Murray Rothbard, right? I think that Murray Rothbard can, in a strategy for liberty, in part 3 of For a New Liberty, he provides us with something very close to a playbook or a blueprint as to how exactly we can build a foolproof kind of institution or a kind of movement where the kinds of problems plaguing other institutions that are originally built for the purpose of advancing liberty, but lose sight of that over time. I think that the most profound thing that we can reflect on, both in terms of my history with Yale and and what has happened to the organization as of late is how exactly do we prevent organizations that are once great from losing their way years after they're established.
Thank you to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Mr. Cooley, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.